Hi there. Now we're in chapter 13. So in this chapter we're going to talk about the parts of the nervous system, the regions of the brain, spinal cord, as well as the nerves. And we're going to talk a little bit about how they work together. Okay, so we have both the sensory and motor divisions, which we've talked about. We've talked about the central and the peripheral divisions of the nervous system. So in this chapter you're going to learn a little bit more about the structures as well as some of those functions. In chapter 14 we'll get really in depth with the functions of the nervous system. So let's first look at how the nervous system forms. Initially, if you remember from the tissue chapter, we talked about how all tissues are formed from the embryo. There's three primary germ layers: ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm, which form at the end of the third week. And those tissues then are going to move on to specialize into certain organs. The ectoderm gives rise to both the skin, the integument, as well as the nervous system. And so here you can see how the ectoderm is functioning. Some of the ectoderm specializes in neuroepithelium, producing that neuroectoderm, and this forms a neural plate and neural fold. So you can see that right here, this little groove right here. The neural plate is going to move on, or is going to eventually fold into what we call a neural tube, which you can see here, and that neural tube becomes the central nervous system. The neural crest, which is found right here, is what gives rise to the peripheral nervous system. And so here at the 4-week mark, we already have the makings of the nervous system. So here we have 3 sections of the nervous system. So the brain has the proencephalon, the mesoencephalon, and the rhomboencephalon, or forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain. The forebrain becomes the cerebrum or telencephalon, and then we have the diencephalon, which is part of that forebrain as well, and that's what makes up the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. Then we have the midbrain, which just moves right over, still being that midbrain, but the hindbrain specializes into either a metaencephalon or a myeloencephalon. The metaencephalon gives rise to the pons and the cerebellum, and then the myeloencephalon becomes the medulla. And then here you see that spinal cord coming off the end. So here's your brain and spinal cord. The brain sits in that cerebral cavity. The spinal cord runs through the vertebral canal. And we've talked about the parts of the brain. Spinal cord has multiple regions as well. We have the cervical region, we have the thoracic region, we have the lumbar region, and then we have the sacral region, and even coxatial nerves. A disorder associated with the spinal cord, which often occurs before birth, which always occurs before birth, I should say, but is often seen and noticed prior to birth, is called spina bifida. So this is a birth defect in which that spinal cord is bulging out of the vertebral canal. So typically those vertebrae are not formed fully, and so you have an area where the spinal fluid, cerebrospinal fluid, can come out, and sometimes with that cerebrospinal fluid you also get neural tissue coming out. So there's different types of spina bifida. The most common is spina bifida occulta, where you have just a small region where the bone does not fuse fully, and in this case typically there's nothing popping out from the spinal cord, but there's always that potential to have some nerve problems. Super common, and most people, if they have it, don't even realize it. Then you have meningocele, where the meninges are out, and there's cerebrospinal fluid out here, but the nerves are not out there. And then the myelomeningocele is the most dangerous form, because you have nerves out here as well, and any treatment that you have could definitely cause problems with those nerves. And there you can see it also. So now we're going to look at the cerebrum a little bit more close so that we can identify the different parts and their major functions. The cerebrum has, or I should say, the brain itself has a unique structure. It has a lot of bumps on it and folds. So that kind of look like wrinkles within the brain. The top portion that everybody recognizes as the brain is known as the cerebrum. And then we have two sides to the cerebrum. We have a right and a left hemisphere, and they are separated by this longitudinal fissure. They're actually connected by this structure called the corpus callosum, which is the largest tract in the brain, and it connects both sides. Here you can see the brain, the cerebrum, I should say, with the different labels. So we have that frontal lobe up here. The frontal lobe is a really important region. It has motor functions. It has our personality. So there's a lot of important parts or functions that occur within that frontal lobe. Here we have the temporal lobe. Here's your parietal lobe and occipital lobe. And for each of these lobes, we have two different sides, because we have the right cortex and then the left cortex. And there are separations, like the central sulcus separates the frontal from the parietal lobe. Lateral sulcus separates the parietal and temporal lobe. There's nothing that separates the occipital and temporal lobe, but we do have, separating the parietal and occipital lobe, a parieto-occipital sulcus. So prior to really understanding brain function, we didn't know, that we knew the brain did a lot for us. We knew that the brain, was able to remember thoughts and that it would stimulate different activities, but we didn't realize that there were specific functions to each region of the brain. Corbinian Brodmann is the first individual to identify multiple regions of the brain, and we use his classification still today. And I'm not going to show a picture like this and ask you to identify all the regions, so don't worry about that. But you do want to understand that Brodmann's mapping is what allows us to identify the different regions. So we now know that the frontal lobe is where our primary motor cortex is located. So motor, conscious motor activity is stimulated by that primary motor cortex. Right next to that, in the parietal lobe, we have that primary somatosensory cortex. So think about like when you have an itch. You feel it, that's this region stimulating your consciousness to be aware of that itch, and then this region is what sends out the response to, hey, scratch that itch. We have Broca's speech area, which is right here. Broca's speech area is one of the areas that is very important in allowing us to speak and understand language. Then we have Wernicke's area over here, another area for speech and understanding of language. the occipital lobe is, of course, your visual lobe, which I think we've talked about probably, or I'm sure if I haven't said it before, I will say it, but it's where vision occurs, where you interpret that information. Hearing is in that temporal lobe. The temporal lobe also is where we tend to get information for smells. Hello, sorry. All right. So these are the areas that we were just talking about. Here you have in the frontal lobe, muscle movement, skeletal muscle movement, so conscious movement, language, personality, and decision making. Parietal lobe right here, we have proprioception, so knowing what our joints are doing, being able to move our joints and stay balanced pretty much. Somatosensory, so this is taking in information from the external environment, and then we can then interpret what to do, and through that motor sensory region, or motor region up here, we can respond. Temporal, hearing and smell, and then occipital is your vision. If we were to cut the brain, the cerebrum, we would see internally that we have different basal nuclei. These nuclei function in allowing us to have more motor control of our body. They produce acetylcholine, and so these two nuclei, so we have the caudate putamen and the globulus pallidus. These two nuclei together form a tract with other nuclei in the lower brain regions. And so they can move through two pathways, either direct or indirect. In both pathways, they're going to move into the thalamus at some point. They're going to stimulate the thalamus. In the direct pathway, that stimulus is going to inhibit thalamic activity, which then inhibits the thalamus from sending signals to the cerebrum. So we're not going to be consciously aware of information, or we're not going to be as consciously aware. Whereas in the direct pathway, we don't inhibit, we activate the thalamus, or we excite the thalamus basically, which then excites the cerebrum, giving us even more awareness of whatever we're doing, whatever information needs to move through. The next region then is the diencephalon. So the diencephalon has, your textbook really talks about two areas of the diencephalon. I'm going to add that epithalamus as well. The diencephalon has some major important functions. It's a relay station for conscious information, so for consciousness, but it's a relay station for also all of the unconscious information. So sensory stimuli move in to the thalamus, and the thalamus then directs it to the right place. So it's kind of like the hub of the brain, if you want to think of it that way. But it also has important functions in homeostasis. It has important functions in the endocrine system. So though it's a nervous system, the nervous system does have serious control over the endocrine system. And so the three regions, we have that thalamus right up here, then we have the hypothalamus here, but then right back here is the epithalamus. The thalamus functions as a relay station. So it takes in information and it kind of decides if that information is important and needs to go to our conscious thought, or if that information is something that needs to go to some other region of the brain to be controlled, but that we don't need to know about. Think of blood pressure. You don't need to know that when you sit up in bed from after waking up, that your blood pressure has to increase. You don't need to know that the bladder is filling. You need to know when your bladder is full so that you can release the urine. but you don't need to know about the filling portion. And so the thalamus kind of helps to filter out information that's not needed or wanted at any given time, which is why typically when you're sitting in a room and there's all kinds of stimuli bombarding you, you can focus on what you're supposed to focus on. The hypothalamus, super important region of the brain, is the autonomic controller. So it takes information and sends it to regions of the brain that are not under conscious control. So it's going to send information for heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, respiration. It takes in information about our thirst, our hunger. It also is the master of the endocrine system. So the hypothalamus produces hormones that stimulate the endocrine system. The hypothalamus also produces hormones that are stored in the posterior region of the pituitary gland and then secreted when needed. Before I go on, I just want to quickly mention this epithalamus. So the epithalamus has the pineal gland, which is this little gland right here. You see the pituitary gland there. The pineal gland is here. Pineal gland is an endocrine structure that controls sleep-wake cycles as well as our biological clock, so that ability to determine if, we want to procreate or not. There's also a region in the epithalamus that sends signals to our limbic system, and our limbic system is our emotional system. So the emotional activities that we like when you smell something and you immediately remember being at grandma's house when you were 6 years old, and it brings back those happy memories. Or when you hear something and it stimulates anger because you remember that you were mad about something. That's your limbic system, your emotional system. The brainstem then is the region of the brain that connects the spinal cord to the cerebrum. It also connects the cerebellum, or connects to the cerebellum. And it has a lot of our autonomic reflex centers. So there's 3 parts to the brainstem: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. Here's that midbrain, here's your pons, and there's your medulla. The midbrain has a superior and inferior colliculi. The superior and inferior colliculi are important in both sound and visual perception. So you can take in sounds and then you are consciously aware of those sounds by this inferior colliculi. And then the superior is going to be part of that pathway to the occipital lobe for being able to be consciously aware of the visions and perceive, understand those visions. There's another region of the midbrain called the tegmentum. Tegmentum is going to take information and send them through cranial nerves and help us in controlling both respiratory and cardiac activities. The pons then is this bulge. The bulge, or this bulging region, contains information, sensory and motor information that is going to be sent to the medulla as well as to the cerebrum. One very important region of the pons is the pontine respiratory center, which stimulates breathing, helps in stimulating breathing. The medulla then has both a cardiac and a respiratory center. So the medulla regulates your heart rate. It regulates the vasoconstriction or dilation of your blood vessels to control blood pressure, and regulates respiratory rate. So we have this respiratory center, that Pontine respiratory center will signal the medulla to determine if we need to breathe faster or slower. And then the medulla sends that signal out. The cerebellum then is your last major region of the brain. The cerebellum is your coordination center. So we have motor movements in the cerebrum and the frontal cortex. That movement is then going to be stored in the cerebellum. And you're going to not only store, but you're going to regulate the movement so that it fine-tunes that activity. So if you're walking and you learn to walk, and then you're walking on something that's maybe not as smooth, you're going to be able to fine-tune that activity so you don't fall. That's that cerebellum. It's a very important region of the brain. I'm going to stop here and we'll get into the spinal cord in our next lecture. Bye.